I hope you liked our first episode where we talked about the witch archetype and it was the new moon is Sag. So how have you been feeling since the new moon and Jupiter going forward?
I've definitely been feeling that forward momentum, a little bit more wind in my sails, a little bit more optimism, like in all of the cliche ways you could imagine. That's how I've been feeling. So I'm very grateful for that. I've been just focusing more on, yeah, my mindset and gratitude and being present. So the new moon was in my fifth house. So really just um you know, being, I think I also associate the fifth house with being present since it's really reconnecting with your joy and your pleasure and yeah, that living in the moment feeling. What about you?
And the fifth house is like the best house in astrology. Um,
It's cute.
yeah, it's really cute. Yeah, I think I just had this renewed sense of faith and hope and just excitement. And I made this promise to myself to put on makeup, get dressed, get out there. I went into the city for the first time in months, like this past weekend, and just walked around the city, hung out with friends, and like that very like jovial Jupiter energy was in the air. And yeah, it feels really good.
Yeah, I love that glamour magic. Just getting a little dressed up. It really works its magic.
Oh yeah, especially since Venus and the Sun and Mercury are transiting my first house, I really take advantage during Sag season.
Yes. Oh my gosh. First house transits
Oh yeah,
are like a
magic.
time of manifestation, calling in just your magnetism and allure off the charts. So anyone who's a Sag rising, soak it up.
Soak it up for sure.
Yeah.
Should we get into it?
Yeah. Let's do it.
Well, first, the reason why we're bringing this topic up is because today, the day we're recording this, is Wednesday, November 30th, 2022. Venus is opposing Mars. Venus is in Sagittarius and Mars is in Gemini. And I was messaging Steph this week. Oh my gosh, there's this bigger Venus Mars story that I would love to get into since the opposition is today.
Yeah. So we're going to unpack some of that. And then we're going to take a look at the Venus and Mars archetypes and how they're showing up recently in the headlines with some of our favorite budding couples and karmic couples.
I can't wait.
So, should we get into Venus and Mars and what they've
Yes.
been up to? I think today it's so poignant and important to talk about these two planets because it is the opposition. So that marks a halfway point of our Venus and Mars story. So similar to like a new moon and a full moon, you can think of this as like our full moon moment because they're sitting across from one another in the sky. So um, let me share my screen.
Yeah, and I guess we're assuming that everybody understands Venus and Mars, the
Mm,
archetypes, and what they represent in your chart. But for me, they really are the feminine and masculine energies that we all have within us. They are personal planets because Venus and Mars are the closest ones to Earth. We are the third rock from the sun. Mars is the fourth, and Venus is the second. So they really do matter. Their transits matter to how we relate to ourselves and to other people. So this is also why when we track their cycles, it's really important to look at.
exactly, exactly. So let's talk through some of these key points.
Yeah, so as I was sharing with Stephanie, I got super nerdy and I went down kind of a rabbit hole. So, the first couple of points that Steph and I noticed was that Venus began the year in a retrograde in Capricorn. I'm sure everybody remembered that. It started in 2021 in December. And at the end of this year, Venus will enter into Capricorn once again. So we begin this year with Venus in Capricorn, and then we end this year in Venus in Capricorn. And I don't know if you want to talk about it now. Maybe we'll talk about it a little later about your like interpretation of Venus and Capricorn.
Mm.
But the next thing is that Venus began the year in a retrograde, and we're going to end the year with a Mars retrograde in Gemini. So, like, these two key planets are bookending 2022 with retrogrades.
Mm-hmm.
The North Node in Taurus is ruled by Venus, and the South Node in Scorpio is ruled by Mars. And what Steph pointed out, which I like, was like, oh my gosh, of course. In 2023, the nodes will change, and the North Node will be in Aries, which is ruled by Mars, and the South Node in Libra, ruled by Venus. So like the planetary, I guess, like North Node, South Node switches.
Yeah. So our focus with the North Node, what we're building, working towards, calling in, and the South Node is generally signified as like a point of release. You know, our focus right now is very Venusian, and what we're releasing is our Mars things. But then next year, when the nodes shift, that swaps. So these two planets are very dynamic and relational, and there's just an extra emphasis throughout multiple different parts of the sky over the next year. So it's just something to take note of. And I think the Aries Libra axis in particular just brings this extra attention to our relationship dynamics, because it really is the me versus we. So it's all kind of compounding on one another is what we noticed.
Yeah, and also we go from feminine, like earth and water, to masculine, fire and air, and both Aries and Libra are cardinal signs. So something about this year being, fixed feminine signs is like you're asked to change something in those regards, and then next year taking action on those things.
Exactly. Yeah. Following your desires, following, your hobbies, what lights you up, your pursuits, your pleasure, reconnecting with your pleasure, reconnecting with your body, being present. And then how do we integrate and act on that next year? So yeah, it's very interesting to see all of that. And Venus retrograde, my Venus retrograde story is an absolute doozy and a downer, but everyone will kind of remember that last year, whether it was relationship issues, issues with coworkers, people in your life, family, it was a little more intense because I think we also had a Mercury retrograde in Capricorn at the same time. And both of those planets were forming conjunctions with Pluto, the planet of taboo, death, transformation, and like the seedier, darker energies inside of life. So it was quite a wild ride at the end of the year. But at the end of this year, we're having kind of act 2. So Venus will go back into Capricorn and trace those steps, and Mercury will go retrograde in Capricorn again. So it's kind of like, think back to last December and early January and what you were sorting through, and similar themes are going to be coming up again.
Fun.
Yeah.
So this slide is just a reminder of the Venus retrograde, which happened December of last year. So exactly like about a year ago, it went retrograde on the 19th at 26 Capricorn. And then a couple days later, it was conjunct Pluto, which I remember because it was like a big deal. People were talking about, oh, that's the time when you're usually with family and a lot of wounds come up. And of course, during the holidays, that always is the case. And then January 29th, Venus station retrograde at 11 Capricorn.
Yeah.
How do you feel about Venus and Capricorn? Because it's not a very sexy place for Venus to be.
Well, my mind goes to like style, the style of Venus and Capricorn. And it's like blazer, tall boots, like boss bitch energy, very refined, put together, classic, chic, can take on the world. But I think when Venus is in a Saturn ruled sign, there can be this inherent tension of like denying oneself pleasure and joy, right? There's that stereotypical hardworking energy that comes with Venus and Capricorn, and the need to grind and to achieve, and to associate achievement with, you know, rewards and recognition, and how that feeds oneself versus finding true joy in, you know, going a little easier on yourself, giving yourself some grace, some slack.
Yeah. I love what you said, because I have the same vision of Venus in Capricorn. She's like wearing a short blazer dress with high-heeled shoes, and she takes no shit.
Yes. Yes. All gold jewelry.
Yes. And she's like, she goes after what she wants. Something I was thinking about during my journaling this time was, what do you value for the long term?
Mm-hmm.
And because Mercury was there and Pluto was there, is like burning down something, like an old structure that is not working for you anymore. And Mercury retrograde was like having you think about it. And then Venus was showing you like the worth and how much you value these things yourself, even, and what you want to take for the long term, which at the time I think those topics were coming up in my mind, but thinking about it in hindsight now, after the year has passed, it really was I guess the seed that planted with the things that I decided, these are the things that I value, these are the things that I want to continue for the long term. And now seeing that, it really did happen that way.
Mm-hmm. Because where did this happen? In your second house?
Second house, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. That totally tracks with what you're working towards and building. Mine was in the sixth house. And during that time, I was taking care of my dad before he passed away. And it was the second person that year that I spent, you know, taking care of it before, as they passed away. And now, this year, I got certified in hospice training, so I can vigil with people and, you know, help them transition and pass in a graceful and peaceful way. And so it really was a seeding point. It was fucking intense.
Yeah.
But there was a value there. Like, I really did find something that I loved in the darkness. And that to me is very Venusian and Plutonic.
Mm-hmm. Wow,
So
that's beautiful.
it's a wild time. So everybody just gear up, because it's coming back.
It's coming back.
But I think this next time will be just like a little smoother, you know?
Yeah, like sealing the deal.
Yes.
Like putting a bow on the Venus project that you've been going on.
Mm-hmm.
Journey, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So should we look at what else is coming up?
Sure, yes.
Okay. Well, part of this story was essentially that every time Venus and Mars meet at the same place in the sky and they form a conjunction, that is like the planting of a seed, the beginning of a new story. And this happened twice last year, which is pretty rare, because they're not going to meet again at the same point in the sky until I think February 2024. So our Venus Mars journey and stories of like, really, when you put them together, it's like bringing something to life, right? Because it's your desires and then how you go after it. When you piece them together, those are the two things you need to exist. So yeah, they formed a conjunction on February 16th in Capricorn, and then they met again, right?
Mm-hmm.
On March 6th at 0 degrees Aquarius. So if you have any placements around 0 degrees Aquarius or 16 degrees Capricorn, you can look to that planet in that part of your house in your birth chart to get more information about like, what is this story looking like for you?
Yeah. Can we just go to the one before?
Mm-hmm.
I want everybody to put a pin in your mind of 16 degrees.
Yeah.
Because that's going to come in later on. The total lunar eclipse in Taurus was at 16 degrees. And so just put that pin in your mind. And then the next slide with the 00 degrees Aquarius, I thought was very interesting because just like a year ago or a year before this, or maybe a little bit more than a year, we had that Saturn and Jupiter conjunction at 00 degrees of Aquarius. So there is a larger cycle within that cycle as well, because that started a 30-year cycle. And then because I actually wasn't born during the Saturn Jupiter conjunction. It was 1980, I believe, in Libra. But I just thought it was a very sensitive area of our charts because it had just been triggered by that Saturn Jupiter conjunction.
And Pluto is going to enter Aquarius at 0 degrees in March. And that is going to
Did you
activate
read
some
my
of this.
mind?
I did. I felt it right there. I was like, Laura, what are you about to say?
Because I was like, there's something else. Yes, exactly. So there's something there, like wherever you have 00 degrees of Aquarius, you're starting this Aquarian story that's going to probably take you for the rest of your life.
And be very life-changing, especially for the next 30 years.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I just wanted to remind people as well during this time in March. I remember this because I did my solar return chart. My birthday is March 20th. I had a Venus besiegement in my chart. And I just remember astrologers talking about this so much and how negative it was. And basically a besiegement is when Venus, a benefic, is in between two malefics, Mars and Saturn. And I was like, this isn't a big deal. Like, whatever, people are making such a big deal out of this. Like, obviously at the mundane level, that's when I think the war in Ukraine started, like bigger things were happening in the world. But for me personally, it was a little accurate.
Yeah.
I just felt like, because this was a Saturn ruled sign, that so many things didn't end up happening that I had planned for, especially Venusian things.
When was that? End of March?
It was like March. It was like all of March. I wrote the dates down here. March 7th to March 28th, Venus, which was in a besiegement.
Yeah. I remember journaling about it, but my brain can't tell you what I wrote. I do know that the 28th was a big deal for me. That was when I had the opportunity to go on the Today Show. So like the second the besiegement ended. And I think that was also the day that Venus formed a conjunction with Saturn, ending the besiegement, right? It moved past Saturn. But that's also another like start of a cycle. And I know leading up to that, my God, did I feel stressed. So yeah, I just remember that period being intense.
And we met during that time.
We met like a day later. Yeah.
Which is so third housey for me. So it makes sense.
And it was in my 7th.
Yeah, you came to my
still my beating heart.
Yeah.
Yeah. So pay attention, put a pin in 0 degrees.
Put a pin on it.
Because we'll be talking about it for some time to come.
Yes.
Okay. And here's just some notes about what Venus and Mars have been up to. I think when I looked at this, most notably, what stood out to me was when Venus and Virgo formed a square with Mars and Gemini, because that marks the first quarter moon, cycle point, the crisis point is taking action. What's happening? So you planted the seeds earlier in March, and what kind of action how is it manifesting right now? But it's a point of crisis, right? Where you make a decision, you do something, you decide to act in some way. So if you can think back to what kind of seeds you were planting, what you were calling in, what you were hoping to go after, fast forward to mid-September, how did it start to manifest, or how did you decide to move forward with those energies?
Yes. I just wrote down some notable dates that that I'm sure I missed most, like a lot of them in here, but yeah, I noticed specifically on September 17th, that first square, um, because that was, I would say, like 10 days after my book launch. And so that was
Mm.
like the square, right? Like, um, and Virgo is my 10th house, and Gemini is my seventh. So I noticed, I was like, oh, but it's interesting because I wasn't sure whether I planted the seed in the first conjunction or the second conjunction or both.
Right.
Because they were traveling together for a while between um like
For
March,
weeks.
yeah, March to April. I think they were like following each other until May when they separated and Mars ingressed into the home sign, and then Venus ingressed into Taurus is
Mm-hmm.
kind of when they started to separate.
They were just like making out and flirting hardcore for months and playing cat and mouse, right? Like, oh yeah, teasing here, teasing there. It
Yeah,
was very flirtatious energy.
very.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because when one would almost catch up, the other would go away.
Mhm. And something that I think in May, which I noticed too, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, like when planets are in their domicile, and it just so happened that they were both in their domiciles at the same time, that things just seem to be moving easier finally,
Mm,
with like Venus was moving. I didn't write this down, but Venus was like really happy because in, I think, March or April, Venus was in Pisces, which
mhm.
Venus loves, and making connections to Neptune and Jupiter, which were lovely. And then it felt like Venus was finally like, bye, to the
Yes.
Olympics.
Yes. It's funny you say that because I did notice a shift in Venusian energy just on a personal level once Venus left Taurus. And part of that for me is that um Taurus is one of my angular houses. It's my 10th house. So when Venus is there, I'm like, oh my gosh, thriving, living my best life. Love it. Um, but yeah, it's been an interesting story. And then not only that, we've been having these eclipses that are taking place in a Venusian sign as well. So we had that April eclipse that was conjunct Uranus and Taurus, which I thought was pretty cute. I enjoyed that one. But the solar eclipse in Scorpio,
Yeah, that one was
doozy.
rough. Yeah.
Yeah.
I should have put those on, but I think I just like knew to like wipe that out of my brain.
Yeah. So those were some other big points throughout these stories because Venus in particular was being activated through those eclipses. And through the most recent eclipses too, we had a Cazimi, which is when a planet, for any astro newbies out there, when a planet is sitting in the heart of the sun, it's known as sitting in the chariot of the sun. It is regal and gains power and strength. And Venus was sitting inside of the sun during the solar eclipse in Scorpio that happened at the end of October. So it was kind of an interesting dynamic because and on one hand, Venus is gaining strength with this Cazimi, but on the other hand, Venus is in Scorpio, which is a planet where it's known by ancient astrologers to struggle a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, like, in a zoomed out way, I think just going back to earlier this year when Venus was in Capricorn and in retrograde, and with Pluto and Mercury, and kind of going through a hard time in Aquarius, that's probably when we all had this bigger vision for ourselves, but it seemed like nothing was working out for us and everything was shit. And then
Mhm.
probably like mid year, we were like, yay. And I think that was also when Jupiter was in Aries, and everyone
Mhm.
was like getting out there, like, I'm gonna make all this stuff happen. And then eclipse season happened in, I think, April to May, and it was like, oh my gosh, like you kind of got bitch slapped in the face.
A
Like,
cosmic reality check.
yeah,
Mhm.
maybe things aren't going to work out for me, and maybe a little, people lost a little bit of hope. And then we had not really a reprieve, because then Leo season was pretty rough with all those squares.
Mars, Uranus, and the North Node meeting at the
Yeah.
same spot in the sky. So yeah, it's kind of like, April, May, March, April, May were like highlights. And
Mhm.
then we've been kind of reeling a little bit since then. And the good news is we made it through the
Mhm.
last eclipses of the year.
Mhm.
Um, and the lunar eclipse that just took place in Taurus was Venus ruled as well.
Yes.
And Venus was kind of hidden and obstructed by the rays of the sun. So it was still in Scorpio and it was still struggling a little bit.
Mhm.
Um, and the moon was right next to Uranus, the planet of surprise, upheaval, awakening. So that was another wave of intensity that we experienced before the year closes out.
Yes. And remember when I said to put a pin on it, this total lunar eclipse in 16 degrees Taurus, conjunct Uranus at 16 degrees. I feel like that was a closing off of a chapter of, maybe not a chapter, because we still have eclipses next year, but um, that 16 degrees conjunction in Capricorn, because I follow numerology, there's something about the 16 degrees that was activated in everybody's chart that I feel, while this last eclipse season wasn't maybe as, I mean, it depends on who you talk to. I feel like it was the closing off of a chapter from the first set of eclipses. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
how do you feel about that?
I mean, it definitely activates that eclipse point, right? The 16-degree mark. So, and it forms a trine, which is supportive energy. So, there could have been something during the total lunar eclipse that was being released or addressed, an old story from the past. With reluctance, it was forming a square to Saturn. Whatever was difficult that you experienced around that time, clearing it out and removing it is giving life and space for this Venus, Mars, whatever you're, in Capricorn at 16 degrees, right? Whatever you are birthing. So there could be something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love this little quote by Liz Green. I love Liz Green's work. And she talks about Venus and Mars. And I really do believe that, again, we have both feminine and masculine energies. And Venus to me is the planet of attraction and what we are attracted to and what attracts to us. And Mars is the planet that is our drive and our ambition. So both are important. We can't just like sit around and like wait all day for the things that we want. We also need that Martian energy of like going after what we want. And so today, on November 30th, we have the Venus in Sagittarius opposing Mars in Gemini.
Yes. So this is like a full moon moment. Um, it can be, a point of tension, but it can also be a point of reaching compromise. So if you have been sorting through something, this is kind of the time to address it. Is your foundation stable, shaky? Is it going to crack? But oppositions are of the nature of Saturn, right? So they can be more intense, but with Venus involved, and coming through in these playful, mutable signs of Sagittarius and Gemini, I think there's some optimism that we can lend there.
Yes. Shall we move on?
Yeah. Well, we talked about this. These are the eclipses, spoiler alert, that we'd been talking about.
Yes.
Wild.
Well,
Wild. Just look at those charts.
the most recent ones, at least
Yes.
the ones we experienced in October and November. And yeah, I think the solar eclipse in Scorpio, which I thought was quite nice personally, but that's just my own opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it was at 2 degrees of Scorpio and it was conjunct Venus, which I thought was interesting. And the ruler of the moon was Mars, which hadn't gone retrograde yet. It was just hanging out there at 25
Mm.
Gemini. So it was, I think, it was like pre-standstill at that point because it was ready to station retrograde. So yeah, that's the Mars Venus story in the solar eclipse.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any thoughts about that?
No, just that, yeah, I remembered the solar eclipse being fine. It was forming a square to my ascendant, and I can't exactly remember what came up. I remember I made a reel that day that did really well, and I was like, rock on, solar eclipse, square my ascendant. But you know, yeah, it came and went, but I think eclipses, a lot of the times people are like, oh my gosh, like what happened on that day? It's like it's a story, you know. So yeah, TBD. I'll report back. You know I will.
Yeah. Yeah. And the story is still unfolding, which is very interesting.
Exactly.
Do you mind just going back a quick second to
Yeah.
the lunar eclipse in Taurus? I just wanted to point out Venus there in Scorpio.
Mm.
Um, and then it was opposing, not exactly, you know, there's still an orb there, a 4 degrees opposing Uranus and the full moon. And by
Yeah.
this time, Mars is officially retrograde.
Right. So Venus is definitely getting shook up a little bit. And I think,
Mhm.
you know, with the moon conjunct Uranus, opposite Venus, when the moon and Venus are opposite one another, it can oftentimes like show up as quarrels within family or people that we're close with. So that was, you know, and Uranus is, here we go. You didn't expect this. So it was an emotionally charged time for sure.
Yeah, and that was the midterm elections, which people thought there would be a red wave, but Uranus actually was expressed through there not being a red wave and actually a blue trickle. And
Mhm.
I think that was the surprise, like the Uranus surprise.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the one thing with Uranus. Anytime I meet with a client and I'm talking with them about a Uranus transit, I just tell them, I'm like, there's no one's going to predict what Uranus is going to do, right? Like I can rattle off 5 to 10 ways that this could manifest for you, but there's going to be good and there's going to be bad. But it's going to, it's the tower. It's like the tower card in the tarot, right? It shakes your foundations and you're forced to start again and build again.
Yeah, for sure.
Mhm.
And then one thing you mentioned, which we'll get more into in the Venus's journey, is between the solar eclipse and the lunar eclipse, Venus actually goes past the south node,
Mm.
and she is quite invisible at this time. She's kind of working behind the scenes, and I don't like to gender planets, but just roll with me. This is how I can speak about it easier. But like you said, Venus is not. She's said to be in her fall, right, or
Detriment.
detriment in
Mhm.
Scorpio. So not particularly happy. I always think of Venus and Scorpio as fatal attraction energy.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Kind of revengeful, kind of like you know, a little claws out. So I don't know if you remember that time, but just another thing to point out. But
Mm-hmm.
we can go to the next slide.
Okay. So Venus's journey. Oh yeah, the Venus Cazimi. That
Mm-hmm.
was big.
Yes. So I just wanted to mention June 22nd, 2022, Venus enters Gemini and kind of was already like laying the foundation for Mars to enter into Gemini.
Mm.
I kind of think of like, because Venus moves faster than Mars, she's kind of priming the topic of that particular house. So just think back again to June 2022, which was also the summer solstice.
Mm-hmm.
You might have had really busy, you were going out, you were chit-chatting, you were socializing. And then September 29th, Venus ingressed into Libra. And I just mentioned that because that's the home sign, the domicile. And then on October 22nd, as Stephanie mentioned earlier, Venus had a Cazimi at 29 degrees of Libra, which is a critical degree, and especially since it's a cardinal sign. And this was a new Venus Libra star point that hadn't happened in 150 years, because previously it had always been in Scorpio, but it just happens that we happen to be alive at these historical cycle endings and beginnings.
Yeah.
Every time I read about this stuff, I'm like, what? Like,
Yes.
what a time to be alive, right?
Yes, we're having major, major transits, especially in 2023. But the Venus Cazimi and the shift of these star points, Venus form, like the different conjunctions form a star, right? A 5-pointed
Yes.
star. Is that okay? So the shift of it, for the past 150 years happening in Scorpio, where Venus is in her detriment and operates a little bit differently, and then to have this dignity gain where we're gaining more strength now in the home sign of Libra. And something I thought that was interesting about this Venus Cazimi in particular was it was at the anaretic degree, 29 degrees. So there was so much content that day about, oh my gosh, like you're getting married, you're getting engaged, it's beautiful, you're in love, this is like the best day of your life. But it's at this anaretic degree. And I think that it was really like overblown a little bit. I think a lot of people actually struggled with those topics in a certain way. I live with an anaretic degree Mars, so I'm very familiar with that point in astrology, but it's a crisis point. So a lot of the times when you have a planet at that degree, it's like about to shift signs, but it's also like remembering and embodying everything it's been through its entire travel through that sign from 0 to 29 degrees. So yeah, it can be this like breaking point, this point of tension. Yeah. So I just think that's important to name in case anyone was like, I didn't fall in love on the Venus Cazimi. Like, it's okay. Don't worry about it.
Oh my God, that's so funny. So I learned all about this in a different wormhole that I went down a couple of months ago with Ariel Gutman. And she actually doesn't necessarily say that this is a romantic day.
Mm,
It's like when Venus, some astrologers see this as malefic when Venus or Mercury goes through the heart of the sun, like it
mm,
burns away karma. And when I think about that, I think that can be quite triggering when you have to like fully be aware of the things that maybe you wish for and you don't have, or the things that you have that you don't want anymore
mm,
with Venusian topics, right? Like relationships or money or whatever the case may be. I think that so many people, and we can do a whole other topic on just Venus, like romanticize Venus as just the light feminine aspect of it, being docile and quiet and tranquil and like Aphrodite. But there is a dark feminine side to Venus, which is like, I believe Venus in Scorpio, who's a
uh-huh.
little like secretive, who's chaotic, who intentionally destructs and breaks things apart, because that's also a part of Venus's job. So I actually don't think that that day was like, yay.
Yeah.
I think it was a critical point to be honest with yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. And this particular star point, it's going to go back into Scorpio before it like officially enters Libra, I think in 2023 or 2024. but some of the things that Ariel Gutman said, where we have been in the Venus in Scorpio star point the last 150 years, was this like reliance on Venus and Scorpio things like oil and like petrol and gas. And something that I really something that I learned, which I was like, duh, is that the reason why oil is associated with Scorpio is because oil is from fossil fuels from dinosaur bones.
And
And I
it's
was
in the
like,
ground.
yeah. And
And
I was
Mars
like, huh.
digs. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So then, like, just when thinking about topics of Libra, Venus in Libra in this new star point, I think about like activism and women's rights and gay rights and just human rights in general and liberation movements and maybe more like renewable energy and moving away from oil and gas stuff.
Using air for energy, right?
Mhm.
Wind.
Yes, exactly.
Um, and yeah, exactly. Balancing the scales. Libra is representative of the scales. So bringing more balance to everyone who has been harmed. Um, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and so Venus, so all of your Venusian topics like money, relationships, and things that Venus rules, you might not have experienced in a while since it went invisible in when it went combust. And it just means, like in layman's terms, because Venus moves quicker around the sun than we do, it was behind the sun, so we couldn't see it. And so like there was Venus and Scorpio was doing something behind the scenes that we weren't privy to. I think that's what it means metaphysically. But it wasn't visible in the sky. And so if you're listening to this, you're in luck, because December 2nd, this week, Venus finally becomes visible as the evening star at 20 degrees of Sagittarius. And Venus as an evening star is in the more feminine, the yin, more romantic version of Venus. And Venus in the daytime expression, which I have in my chart, is more of like the warrior archetype, more in yang, the masculine. So I think that's really beautiful and a good sign of things to come, because when Venus was in the daytime star, it was, I think, when also the war in Ukraine happened. And so Venus was a little bit more aggressive. And so now Venus becoming visible as an evening star, she'll be a little bit more amenable to relationships and be a little bit softer.
I think, yeah, it's interesting because I have an evening star, you have a morning star. So you tell me if this is accurate, but on like a personal level, the way that like evening star and morning star expresses themselves, or from what I've read and from my personal experience, evening stars are said to be a little more reserved and cautious, right? Like when in their approach to love. So it's like it's funny. My husband, we've been together over 4 years, and he jokes all the time. He's like, you were still skeptical about me like last week, which is like so not true, but I am such like a whoa, I don't know. And I've always been like that in love, like very, very, standoffish, a little. It takes a lot for the evening star to kind of like warm up and flow. Whereas like the morning star, which tracks with all of like the yang energy that you were expressing, they're more like, let's give it a whirl, like diving in, love at first sight, like doing this, doing that, and giving love a chance, going after it, taking action. Whereas the evening star approach is like, well, prove it to me. Like, let me see what work you do. And then if I'm receptive to it, I'll open up. So,
I love that.
yeah. So in matters of love, you may become a little bit more, you may just pause, be a little bit more practical. I don't know.
You also have your Venus in Virgo, right?
Yes.
which I think is also skeptical.
Oh my gosh. Is it ever? Yes.
And
Yes.
like, let's take it step by step.
Yes. Yes. So I get the double whammy there, but
Yeah.
I digress. Okay.
Yeah, I definitely so I have Venus in Aquarius, which is a Saturn ruled sign. So I think having a Venus that is in more of a masculine expression, I'm not afraid to um like I think it's less romantic too. Like a
Mm.
Venus as a morning star and Venus in Aquarius is very like practical. And it's like, let's just get cut to the chase. Like, do you like me or not? Like, why are we playing games? Like, I don't do games. Like, you either like me or you don't.
Mhm.
I don't have
Mhm.
time for this.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Mars retrograde.
Yeah. So this is the last slide.
Mhm.
Um, did you want to start off? Did you want to kick it off?
Sure. Sure. So Mars entered Gemini around August 20th. And this was a time where you're starting to get clues about your Mars retrograde story. So, which house does Gemini occupy in your birth chart? Those house topics are going to be activated. Um, the shadow period is when Mars begins to trace over points of its retrograde journey that it will come back and revisit. So that started in September 3rd. We're getting even more specific clues about what our retrograde journey and story is about. And it stationed retrograde right before Halloween on October 30th. So at that point, you can use October 30th as a marker. If you're a daily journaler, which I can't recommend enough if you want to study astrology, go back to that day or go through your text message, go through your photos. That's another great way to see kind of like what was going on for you at that time. You can get more clues. But at this point, we're probably feeling very scattered brained. Mars in Gemini is already all over the place. And as we're building up to the retrograde, I felt like I had like a million ideas. I'm like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do this, everything's possible, limitless, limitless. And then the retrograde happens and it's like, oh, let's back up. Like, how do I want to invest my energy? Where do I want to invest it? What's sustainable? And it's that revision period. So yeah.
Yes. And I'm sorry, I've been using Eastern time zone. So this happened to us on the East Coast on October 31st. But yeah, no, I just say that because we both have Virgo placements, and I just want to I just want to make that like very clear.
Just for us. Yes, it's true. I love it.
Yeah, so Mars usually spends like 6 to 7 weeks in a sign, right? Like 6, 7 weeks. But Mars is spending 7 weeks, 7 months in Gemini. So this is a huge activation, initiation in your Gemini house, and specifically between 8 and 25 degrees. So right now we're going through it. I think we're halfway through the retrograde, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This full moon on December 7th, I think, that marks the halfway point of the Mars retrograde. And with the moon conjunct exactly Mars, it's going to be a decision point. Like everything you've been confused about, not sure which way to go, it's shining the light on something. And a piece of information in particular is coming your way.
Yes. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And that's also at 16 degrees, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's something there.
Mm-hmm.
Um but yeah, and then Mars will go direct at 8 Gemini on January 12th of next year. And then the post shadow, which is like the integration of all of your Mars retrograde lessons, and then it officially leaves 25 degrees Gemini on March 15th. So we still have a lot of Mars in Gemini, which I'm just like, wow, it's been quite the trip already.
The vibe is exhausting. Yeah. Yeah.
It's wild. Um, it's wild. But I also wanted to bring towards everyone's attention that we had a Mercury retrograde
Mm-hmm.
last year in Gemini, around the same degree points. And then the year before that, in 2020, we had a Venus retrograde um, around also the same degree points. So clearly, the universe is like, you need to work on this area of your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
First, you have to think about, like, in 2020, it was what do you value as a Venus retrograde, and then the Mercury retrograde last year was what do you think about it, how do you communicate about it, and then this year is like the decision and the action point.
I love beautiful.
Yeah.
Chef's kisses. Exactly. From the
Thank you.
universe.
From the
Yeah.
universe.
Yes.
And I'm still trying to work out what that is. I mean, I have Gemini in my 7th house, so it's like going back and forth over my descendant. So clearly it's one-on-one relationships. And I was just telling Stephanie before we pressed record that my Gemini house is trining my Aquarius house, which Saturn is right now. And everybody that I knew in 2020 is like gone from my life.
Well, it's mine was in my 11th house. So it's also about associations and friends and groups, and a very similar experience. Said goodbye to many a folk in my life.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The universe yeeted all of them out.
Yeah. Yeah. And then we also had honorable mention, the eclipses taking place.
Right.
In the Gemini Sagittarius axis. So the North Node was in Gemini, pulling in, magnetizing us towards something. So essentially the Gemini part of your chart has been incredibly active over the past couple of years. And I think it's important to note that this Mars retrograde is kind of a precursor for some other Gemini transits. We are going to have Jupiter enter Gemini, I think in 2024, and eventually the Uranus return for the United States will be coming, I think, in 2026. Don't quote me. That we'll do a future episode on that. But there's some major transits. Bigger, slower moving, the outer planets. So we're doing the internal work now, and then we're having like seismic shifts coming up in this part of our chart still to come. So yeah.
I love that you said that, because I really do believe that we in our own lives and within ourselves and our community around us is a microcosm for the macrocosm of the United States, which is going through its Mars return right now. And then, Uranus going there with its Uranus return. And so it's almost like we're being prepared to like integrate the duality within ourselves, because Gemini is the twins and the duality, so that we can better show up for the collective in some way. I'm totally making this up, but I'm just like, all of this Gemini activation has to be for a reason.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So stay tuned. I'm sure we'll be talking about Jupiter and Uranus and Gemini down the line. But for now, this is what we've got going on in the stars.
Yeah. So this is I think the last slide. Do you want to go into the celebrities, or did you have another transit you wanted to share?
Yeah. Let's we have some examples of Venusian and Martian energy in the sky, kind of just based on pop culture and what's going on right now. The first one that I want to share is Jenna Ortega's chart. So Jenna Ortega is playing Wednesday on Netflix's latest series. And we've got her chart here and the chart of the premiere. And something that I think is so interesting about Jenna's chart in particular, and this has to do with Venus and Mars, is that She's playing Wednesday Addams, classic goth icon. And she has Venus and Scorpio, which is major goth vibe. So the way that she presents, personally and professionally in this movie, it's just a seamless fit. And her Mars placement is in Virgo. And for me, I'm only a couple episodes in, but the deadpan, like her delivery is so on point. That is so Mars and Virgo, like so precise. And just straight to the chase. So I just think she really embodies these archetypes, especially in these signs. And I just thought it was magical the way that she brings this character to life. And then the premiere of the show, like I read something earlier this week that said the views like surpass Stranger Things. So it's like doing really, really well. And what I thought was interesting about the premiere date is there's all of these planets in Sagittarius, the Sun, Venus, and Mercury in Sagittarius on the premiere date. And they're all pretty close to her Pluto, which is opposite her moon in her birth chart. So anytime Pluto is getting activated in a chart, like sure, sometimes there's intensity. She's probably dealing with some shit in her private life, but at the same time, Pluto gains power, or it gives power and recognition when you put in tons of hard work. So it just, I thought that was a really interesting aspect that kind of activated her chart. And Mars retrograde is going over her moon. So there's definitely more to this story. And the South Node at the time of the release was conjunct her Venus and Scorpio. So it just to give examples of like astrology is so applicable. It comes to life in so many ways.
I love that the full moon in Gemini is happening conjunct to her moon. So
yeah,
I know it's in the third house, but
well, I don't know her time.
Oh, okay.
I made this up.
So like, so if we were to do like what is it called? When you like
Rectification. Yeah.
I would think that would be a 10th house moment. Like having that huge career break, because I know she was famous before this movie, but I didn't know about her at all. And I absolutely fell in love with her. I binged watched this show because I'm obsessed with Wednesday Addams. I loved the one with Christina Ricci. And I don't know, I resonate so much with Wednesday Addams.
Yeah.
But I think having a full moon moment like that, like with the North Node there, it's like destiny.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Her chart is definitely getting lit up. And something else that's super beautiful in her chart is she was born during a Mercury Cazimi. Yeah. She's got the Sun and Mercury both in Libra. Mercury's retrograde, but it's during the second part of the retrograde, right? Where it's, about to reverse. It's already met with the Sun, and then eventually it's going to station direct and move forward. So that can signify eventually like a reversal of fate or fortune, and in her case, like delicious. So
she has a Virgo Mars, which is square to the Gemini Mars.
Yes. So she's going through her Mars square. Yeah. And this would be a closing square for her. So it's like that kind of checks out. It makes a lot of sense if you think about I know that she was in the show You. Did you ever watch that stalker show?
I only watched the first season and I got so creeped out.
Yeah, well, guilty as charged. I loved it. It's my Sun square Pluto, but she was in it, and she was in something else, but I can't remember. Some Disney thing, but yeah. So she's had fame and success, but this is like catapulting her to a new level. And the closing square, it just means that that's where Mars is in the sky before it returns to Virgo, where it was when she was born. So it's kind of like this deeper shedding, integration of lessons. Like I can't imagine, while there's probably so much to celebrate and so much joy, it's probably also there's probably a lot you have to let go and your old life, right? Like she's stepping into a new level of fame. So there is a shedding of some sort going on for her.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is what I have just about the Venus and Mars archetypes. And we do have, it's 2:00 over here, 5:00 over there. But we do have more Venusian and Martian archetypes to share. We'll give you some spoiler alerts for our future episodes. We are going to talk about Emrata and everyone's favorite BDE, Pete Davidson. And just ask Laura's mom if you want to know what BDE means. She just Googled it, right? You just gave her a lesson.
My parents watch like all of the celebrity gossip, like TV shows like Entertainment Tonight and Access Hollywood. And it just seems like Pete Davidson is dating the most beautiful person like every month.
Mm-hmm.
And yesterday, my mom and dad were like, what is with Pete Davidson? He keeps ending up with these gorgeous models. And I'm like, it's BDE. And they didn't know what that meant. And I was like, Google it, mom. So she Googles it and she's like, oh my God. Because the first thing that comes up is big dig energy. But I think it's more than that. I think it's his Scorpio placements. He has a stellium in Scorpio. And I just remembered that. So I told Steph about it. And I think we both have an obsession with Emrata. So
yeah, so that will be a very fun one to look at. Yeah. And we don't have Pete Davidson's birth time, but Pete Davidson, if you're listening, DM, send it. We need it. I am here to make the case that he has a Sagittarius moon. That man is a comedian. He's got funny bones in his body. I don't think he has a Capricorn moon. So we need the birth time to confirm, but we'll be diving into that next week and his chemistry with Emrata. And everyone's favorite Leo iconic legendary couple, J-Lo and Ben. So we've got lots to unpack there in terms of love, and we'll just stay tuned because we'll have some other fun topics to go through as well.
Yes. Legendary couple with, I think, Scorpio moons, right?
And Leo suns.
And Leo suns, right. Okay. Yes, I can't wait to talk about that because I've also tracked that relationship.
Such a wormhole dive and so good.
Such a wormhole. Yay.
Well, thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you next week at 1:00.
Bye.
Bye.